It is a pleasure to be here today to present this analysis, which comes in the continuity of the PhD research that has been developed over these 2 years, and it's titled Between the Plain Architecture and Baroque Architecture, a facade model of churches of São Miguel in the Azores, and makes the inclusion of the religious architecture of the Azores in the national historiography. There is a post-Kublerlian historiography that has been refined over the last few years by various authors. George Kubler played a fundamental role in developing the concept of plain architecture and drawing attention to design and morphology of several architectural examples for many years that were ignored by European historiography as they didn't fit into Renaissance, Mannerist and Baroque styles. Azorean religious architecture remains on the fringes of this reading. For this reason, this study analyzes the design of the plans and main facades of churches in the Azores, featuring the existence of a facade typology in churches built in the 18th and 19th centuries on the island of São Miguel, Azores. Methodologically, this article seeks to dissect post-Kublerlian research on plain architecture for Portugal and the islands and use the same methodology for Baroque architecture, with the aim of better understanding the Azorean churches under review. Inside the national plain architecture, Kubler shows the various applications of plain architecture through this historical void, marked between the reign of King Manuel I and King John V. This is an architecture characterized by ornamental simplicity, a simple structure, and richness in its design proportions. Horta Correia takes Kubler's study and refines it. Thus, Correia argues that there was room for various artistic movements in this historical period and that the movements cannot be understood as autonomous realities, but rather as movements dominated by trends in plain-spoken architecture. On the other hand, with the advance of time and studies, plain architecture tends to narrow and consequently some of the examples studied by Kubler can't be inserted into this category. See the examples of the studies by Varela, Gomes and Sinos. Thus, it can be concluded that the 4 authors don't share the same examples of religious buildings. They only share the same opinion about the cathedrals of Leiria, Porto Alegre and Miranda do Douro, whose spatial concession is the whole church, which both inside and out is characterized by values of simplicity, austerity, depuration, in a military character by the constructive solutions of the time. Within the insular plain architecture, Nestor de Sousa and João Vieira Caldas shows the various applications of plain architecture in the Azores through 2 specialities, the churches with 3 naves or cryptocollateral or single nave. Caldas depends the study. On the other hand, Dias claims that there are few examples of plain architecture in the Azores and that they are not very erudite and poorly assimilated when they happen. We can conclude from the analysis of the 3 authors that they don't share the same examples of religious buildings of plain architecture in the archipelago, and that they only share the same opinion about the Jesuit churches of Angra do Heroísmo and Horta and the Cathedral of Angra. In general, in the Azores, there is a notable absence of plain architecture examples, insofar as plain architecture extends over time and develops parallel with Classicism and Baroque, assuming hybridisms. However, the unified space typology don't annul the 3-nave program. Inside the insular Baroque architecture, Paulo Varela Gomes and José Pereira share the same opinion, stating that insular Baroque is a link between national and Brazilian Baroque, marked by decorative excess and the introduction of a new speciality. Nestor de Sousa and João Vieira Caldas complete this study by stating that at the same time in the Azores, a Baroque with a greater representativeness would emerge, marked by classicist and plain roots, whether in the tripartite spatial typology with a single wooden roof or in its facade with a compositional matrix of classical reference combined with decorative elements of classical and Baroque reference, both in a plane planimetry. Pedro Dias concludes that the island's Baroque is not watertight, insofar as there are examples of Gothic or classical foundations that will undergo remodeling and alterations to suit the new style. Thus, Baroque would be the style with the greatest predominance and practice in the archipelago. We conclude from the analysis of the 5 authors that they don't share the same examples of Baroque religious buildings in the archipelago, since they have detected 2 variants of Baroque on the islands. Thus, with less representation in the Azores but common to the 5 authors, we have the churches of Misericordia in Ribeira Grande and the parish church of São Pedro in Ponta Delgada. For Sousa, Caldas and Dias, the most representative examples are in the Franciscan conventual churches of Horta and Ponta Delgada and the parish church of Nossa Senhora de Guadalupe in Guadalupe on the island of Graciosa. It's from this typology of archaic churches we can conclude that there is a disarticulation between the design of the plant and the facade, corresponding to a plan with the ideology of plain architecture and a facade with a compositional matrix of classical reference combined with decorative elements of classical and Baroque reference, both familiar in the utility sense and the apparent military solidity of plain architecture. Thus, it was possible to observe that the first churches presenting this type of facade were the parish churches of Nossa Senhora da Estrela in Ribeira Grande and São Sebastião in Ponta Delgada. According to our study, both are reminiscent of the Nossa Senhora de Guadalupe convent church in Ribeira Grande. However, these 3 exemplars present several incongruencies, as can be read from the drawing of its facade, section and plan. The conventual church of Nossa Senhora de Guadalupe, being conventual, presents a different program and follows the model used by Franciscans in the Azores, that is to say, a facade divided by vertical sections that announce the internal division. Although this doesn't happen in this church, the use of 3 arcs on the ground floor to connect it to the narthex and the implementation of a single tower integrated into the pediment located at the ground and set back. The São Sebastião church in Ponta Delgada, being a 16th century construction, presents a Gothic matrix both in its spatial composition and its elevations, mainly by its manueline doorways, which despite its Baroque intervention, with the implementation in the main frontage of 2 Baroque ornamental doorways flanking the manueline doorway or 4-window at the upper level and an undulating crowning. It didn't annul its genesis, creating an assemblage. On the other hand, the church of Nossa Senhora da Estrela in Ribeira Grande is the only one that was designed from scratch, with plans and elevations presenting a plan of the work referring to the dimensioning of its structural and decorative elements, as well as a harmony of measures and proportion that can be captured through its proportional systems. The research concludes that these 3 examples result from a direct model of plain architecture in terms of its tripartite speciality of 3 naves with illumination through peripheral walls and a single glabbed roof, a dominant typology in central and southern Portugal. And by the composition of the facade demarked by a matrix of classical reference marked by the pilasters and the entablatures, which reflects the internal space and a military character, and by the decorative elements of Baroque reference, which are a plain simplicity. Thanks.